It's good to be here, hopefully allergy-free. And Alan, let me just assure you, it's some years since I've been in right mind. So, the poet William Edgar Stafford writes, "It is a time for all the heroes to go home, if they have any. Time for all us common ones to locate ourselves by the real things we live by." It's time for all the heroes to go home, if they have any. Time for all us common ones to locate ourselves by the real things we live by. Picture the scene. A large crowd has gathered. Thousands of people, maybe as many as 6,000 people. Some of them have been traveling the whole day to make it there. Events are drawing to a conclusion. Soon the people in the crowd are going to have to finally decide what they're going to do. Soon the outcome is going to become clear. Maybe as soon as tomorrow. In the meantime, all the folk in the crowd know what they've come for, know what they're wanting to hear. They want to hear about winning, about victory, about success. They want to know how they're going to deal with the opposition, how they're going to win. And they want to hear from the one who's going to get them there. Now, I'm not talking about the crowd that had come to listen to Jesus, although I might have been. I'm talking instead about the 6,000 people who on Thursday evening gathered in Wembley Arena to hear the last hustings before the polls closed and members of the Conservative Party are able to choose the next Prime Minister. And I want to be really clear, I'm using that simply as an example. It could have been any number of political parties or political rallies or protest movements or whatever. But people come wanting to be inspired by the speaker, to hear how it is they're going to march from where they are to victory. And they want the hero to whip up the crowd. And they all want at the end of the speech to say, we want to follow him or her. And of course, throughout much of history, it's sadly been more likely to be a him than a her. And the one thing that we know is that before too long, the hero ends up being a villain. Just think how quickly some leaders have fallen from grace. And now I want to turn from whatever leaders or rallies or protest movements or whatever spring to mind, where a powerful orator delivers a powerful message that we all wanted to hear. And I want us instead to listen. To listen as part of the crowd that was following Jesus. Following Jesus as he made his way from Galilee to Jerusalem. And as we do so, to perhaps just glimpse, a very different sort of leadership and the call to a very different sort of followership. We who are there that day, we're like so many crowds. We're looking for a cause. We're looking for a hero. We're looking for someone who articulates what we want to happen. Someone who will make complex things simple. Someone who will make hard things go away. And how easy and how tempting it would have been for Jesus that afternoon or evening to whip us up with his powerful oratory and his unrealistic expectations of what lay ahead, to encourage us all to join him on the people's march to Jerusalem. And yet, he does exactly the opposite. He makes two statements, and he gives two examples, all of which have a single intention: to get us who are in the crowd to recognize the cost that will come our way if we choose to be with them on the next stage of the journey towards Jerusalem. If we choose to give up on our ways of living and instead pass over our lives to him. To follow me, he tells us, you're going to need to love me more than your family or anyone else, including yourself. God, that's not something that kind of whips you up and gets you thinking, yeah, I'm right here, is it? And indeed, there's a case that the translation here has actually been watered down. This is about loving far less, not just liking a wee bit more. This is about loving far less. It's kind of like loathing your family and everyone else by comparison to your love for Jesus. Jesus, you see, is trying to make clear to us who are in the crowd that day that joining the radical movement that we now call church is one which will bring shame upon us and upon our families, and one which will come at an enormous cost. In following Jesus, he says, in following Jesus, we need to know what we're getting ourselves into. There's a cost to discipleship. You're going to have to bear the heaviest of burdens, he tells us. It's almost impossible, I think, for us to hear talk about the cross, about carrying the cross, and experience the visceral fear that the crowd who heard Jesus speak that day would have felt. This cross was the weapon of state murder, whereas for us it's become the symbol of hope and resurrection. I remember hearing about a church in one of the southern states in the US which had quite deliberately taken all the images of the cross out of their church building and had replaced those images with the electric chair, which still stood as the symbol, as the example of state murder in their area. And standing in that crowd, or sitting in that crowd, we need to be aware that people would glimpse the cost of discipleship, the cost of following Jesus. In 21st century Scotland, that sounds ridiculous. In first century Palestine, it was real. And it remains real for Christians across the world today. I think of friends who left the nation that they still want to call home because they'd seen their family murdered by the state because of their desire to follow Jesus. This business about following Jesus, it comes at a high cost. So know what you're getting into before you get into it, says Jesus. Don't be like the builder who starts off with grand designs and then runs out of money halfway through the project. And we've all seen them, haven't we? Or don't be like the leader who takes his country into battle without having really thought through whether the war can be won and at what cost. And we've all seen that happen, haven't we? Most of the time, when heroic leaders get in front of people like us, in that crowd, that afternoon or evening, they take the opportunity to whip us up into a frenzy of excitement, to get us to follow them, to persuade us to forget about our doubts, our questions, our worries, to convince us that it'll all be all right. There's nothing to worry about. But Jesus, a completely different sort of leader, seems intent on doing exactly the opposite. It's as if he's actively encouraging the crowd to disperse, to go away, to go back to what they were doing. certainly the case that he's encouraging each one of us who are within the crowd that day to think carefully about the cost of following Jesus, and to leave, to go back home if we're not sure that the price is worth paying. And Jesus won't love any of those who make that decision any less, because Jesus is love. In a couple of minutes, we're going to sing a hymn written by the great German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now, some of us might know that Bonhoeffer was executed in Buchenwald concentration camp near the end of the Second World War. As a young, brilliant theologian, he had left Germany in his late 20s and was teaching theology in Union Theological Seminary in New York. But when Hitler came to power, Bonhoeffer recognized that he could not stay in the safety of the United States. And he chose instead to return to his native Germany, where he formed part of the underground church, and where ultimately he took part in a failed attempt to assassinate Hitler, and so to seek to bring the war to an early conclusion. Bonhoeffer's writings, including letters and papers from prison, and a book called The Cost of Discipleship, became theological bestsellers, if there is such a thing. They became so not just because they articulated what faith means in deeply, deeply troubling times, but because they came from the pen and the heart and the soul of a man who counted the cost and made the decision, no matter the cost, to follow Jesus. So here we are. Here we are standing in the crowd, listening to Jesus. A Jesus who doesn't offer us an easy time, but rather a heavy burden. But nonetheless, a Jesus who still says to us, to you and to me, if you're up for it, if you're up for it and you have a sense of the cost and you still want to come and follow me. A Jesus who meets us in bread and in wine, not as a hero, but as a host. A Jesus who calls us to a way of following and a way of leading, which is about humility and service, and is about fragility and about love. And all are welcome. it is time for all the heroes to go home, if they have any. Time for all us common ones to locate ourselves by the real things we live by. Amen.